other one is, well, that's good to know. Also, to recruit people, we are interested in getting more members of Indiana German Heritage Society. It's a statewide organization dedicated to understanding, researching, sharing, and enjoying the rich German heritage of the state of Indiana, which is very broad and deep. So our speaker tonight is the title is German Freethinkers in Indianapolis. Our speaker tonight is Justin Clark, who is a public historian and serves as the Digital Initiatives Director at the Indiana Historical Bureau. And I'll just have a note there. Indiana Historical Bureau is the organization with which we have worked because they have the official historical marker program, such as the one for the demise of German language press, which we sponsored there at South Delaware Street. The division of which is a division, the Historical Bureau is a division of the Indiana State Library. Justin holds a BS in History Political Science from Indiana University, Kokomo, and an MA in Public History program at IUPUI. His graduate research focused on the orator Robert Ingersoll and his contributions to Midwest free thought. In his spare time, Justin loves reading, music, movies, and travel. And he is immersed himself in Indiana history. He's grew up in Shelbyville, which has lots of Germans, and also Shelby County, and then also grew up some time in Peru and Kokomo. So I'm going to turn it over to Justin, and we're very thrilled to have you here. And by the way, I learned about your program because you were featured on the radio program, Who's Your History, which is the program of Nelson Price. And you did a fine job on that. I thought, boy, this guy needs to talk to us. So I'll turn it over to Justin.
Thank you, Bill. I really appreciate the warm introduction. Good evening, everyone. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to share my PowerPoint presentation with you. So we're going to start my slideshow. Hopefully, give me a second. There it goes. Perfect. Give it a second. We'll get there. All right, there we go. So again, thank you all so very much for having me here tonight. I'm really excited to give this chat with you. I was mentioning before we went live that the last time I actually gave this talk was in Germany, when I was invited to the University of Munster and Westphalia to present this talk to students. So really glad to be able to share it again with you this evening. So yeah. So in Indianapolis, during the late 19th century, 1870 to 1900, the religious and cultural landscape changed dramatically. More and more Hoosiers gravitated towards alternative versions of Christianity, most notably Catholicism and Methodism. Alternatively, ideas concerning free thought, the open evaluation of religion and its claims, also found an audience within both the general public and formal organizations. This period is often referred to by scholars as the golden age of free thought, an era where organized criticism of religion and advocacy of the separation of church and state entered the American mainstream. Lawyer and politician Robert Greene Ingersoll, also known as the Great Agnostic, routinely gave lectures criticizing religion, spirituality, and the influence of the church on American society. Locally, the most influential element of free thought in the city was the Freethinkers Society of Indianapolis, founded by the German Americans in 1870. As one of the city's first non-religious organizations, the society facilitated an outgrowth of free thought ideas and practices through educational lectures and social gatherings, very similar to what we're doing tonight. As philosophical radicals, the society's members saw their activism as a corollary of the revolutionary spirit of the Turnvereins, social clubs founded by German immigrants to America that advocated physical fitness, education, and democratic ideals. Yet, The society's larger influence was more intellectual than institutional. In particular, Clemens Vonnegut's writings and ideas profoundly influenced his family and the literary achievements of his great-grandson, Kurt Vonnegut Jr., specifically the younger man's ideas about religion, science, and ethics. The Junior Vonnegut's own Midwestern brand of free thought, in the form of what scholar Todd F. Davis called a postmodern humanism, displayed a deep sense of skepticism about the irrationalism of his time, while simultaneously championing an ethical responsibility to others and each other, devoid of supernatural influences. Yet, true to his form as a freethinker, Kurt forged his own humanist identity. The relationship between the Indianapolis Freethinkers and the German-American intellectual heritage traced to a deeply respected intellectual who provided the movement with credibility, Karl Heinzen. A product of German liberalism and the failed revolutions of 1848, Heinzen rejected the more traditional leanings of his compatriots and created a more radical philosophy that heavily influenced German Americans during the late 19th century. Heinzen believed deeply in the power of human reason to forge a new German identity, one predicated on Heinzen believed deeply in the power of human reason to forge a new German identity, one predicated on Republican government, the separation of church and state, and progress through science. His professional relationship with Hermann Lieber, one of the founders of the Freethinker Society of Indianapolis, brought his ideas to Indiana through publications of his lectures. In turn, Heinzen's ideas further influenced the future Freethinker Society, both in its politics and its opinions regarding religion and spirituality. Karl Peter Heinzen was born on February 22, 1809 in Grevenbroich, Dusseldorf, Germany, to Joseph Heinzen and Azette Schmitz. Raised as a Catholic, Heinzen's education in science, particularly in anatomy at the University of Bonn, influenced his growing radicalism. After entering national service, Heinzen spent time abroad in Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, Indonesia, and wrote about his experiences in his first book, Journey of a German Romanticist in Batavia, published in 1845. His time in the East radicalized him on the issue of slavery. Seeing the natives as slaves deeply affected the young Heinzen, and he would spend the rest of his life fighting against the terrible practice. After returning home from abroad, Heinzen spent time as a tax collector before his foray into political writing. He wrote pamphlets critical of the Prussian government, which agitated the authorities and spurned his eventual flee to the United States in 1847. Once he had heard of the revolutions encircling Europe, and in particular Prussia during 1848, Heinzen actively participated in the call for major reforms of the monarchy. The Prussian Revolution, escalated by fierce protests throughout Berlin and Greater Prussia for most of 1848 and 1849, ultimately failed from a lack of consensus on the nature of reforms. As such, Heinzen finally fled to the United States in 1850, and like many politically radical Germans, attempted to instill his reforms in his new home country. His early attempts at publishing were met with little interest, but with the founding of The Pioneer in 1854, Heinzen found an outlet for his views that would last over 25 years. A radical newspaper in Boston, Massachusetts, The Pioneer regularly published articles that favored the end of slavery, African-American emancipation, and a strict separation of church and state. During his years in the United States, Heinzen cultivated relationships with other religious and political radicals. One such radical was the celebrated Illinois freethinker Robert Ingersoll. The two met in 1878 at Ingersoll's home in Washington, D.C. Heinzen recalled his time with the great agnostic with both respect and disappointment. While he appreciated the colonel's generous, jovial, and entertaining persona, Heinzen saw Ingersoll's politics as too conservative. As biographer Carl Wittke noted, Heinzen was disappointed that his, meaning Ingersoll's, radicalism did not go beyond the boundaries of religion. Nevertheless, they both appreciated the progressive nature of science, most notably the work of German naturalist and philosopher Alexander Friedrich Heinrich von Humboldt. Humboldt, like Ingersoll and Heinzen after him, was an out-and-out empiricist. Facts, numbers, measurements, these, not philosophical speculation, were for him the building blocks of science. Born in Berlin in 1769, Humboldt became one of the most widely respected scientists of the 19th century. His expeditions to Central and South America illuminated the scientific community on the geology, biology, and even sociological aspects of the region, and his efforts led to his admission to the American Philosophical Society in 1804 by then President Thomas Jefferson. However, his influence on the German freethinkers came in two forms. First, a commitment to empiricism and the scientific method, and second, an impassioned resistance to the practice of slavery. The latter element reinforced by witnessing it firsthand on his expeditions. Alexander Humboldt's contributions to science and skepticism left a broad, indelible stamp on the 19th century. As evidence of his influence, both Karl Heinzen and Robert Ingersoll wrote lectures on the ideas of Humboldt for the centennial of his birth on September 14, 1869. Ingersoll delivered his in Peoria, and Heinzen delivered his in Boston. In his speech, Ingersoll focused on Humboldt's contribution to the expansion of scientific knowledge and his commitment to naturalism and empiricism. He was one of the few, Ingersoll declared, great enough to rise above the superstition and prejudice of his time, and to know that experience, observation, and reason are the only basis of knowledge. It is also in this speech that Ingersoll places science's features within a philosophical naturalism, one in deep contrast with religious ideas. Ingersoll explained, "Superstition has always been the relentless enemy of science. Faith has been a hater of demonstration. Hypocrisy has been sincere only in its dead of truth. And all religions are inconsistent with mental freedom." Ingersoll believed that Humboldt's influence lay deeper than with simply scientific ideas. Rather, his creation of a complete intellectual system of naturalism left an influence felt deeply among both Germans and American freethinkers. Heinzen felt very much the same way. His lecture from 1869 was published by the Association for the Propagation of Radical Principles, an organization run by one of the Indianapolis Freethinker Society's future co-founders, Hermann Lieber. Like Ingersoll, Heinzen emphasized Humboldt's materialism, but also stressed his diplomatic nature with those with religious beliefs. There are those who will be horrified by the discovery that Humboldt, Heinzen wrote, who never carried an open war against belief in religion, and who was even on the best terms with the most prominent advocates of religious views, was an atheist and materialist. Nevertheless, Heinzen described Humboldt's stern commitment to science, writing that all that which does not harmonize with it, meaning science, he declares indirectly to be nothing but chimera. Humboldt defined his world in Heinzen's perspective through understanding nature and its laws, while rejecting all that is in contrast with materialism. These concepts motivated Ingersoll and Heinzen's lectures and their own devotion to the scientific method. Even though the German freethinker resided in Boston, Massachusetts, his ideas spread throughout the Midwest. In particular, Heinzen's lecture on Humboldt was published by the Association for the Propagation of Radical Principles, as I mentioned earlier, an organization run by Hermann Lieber from Indianapolis. This organization, run out of Lieber's own business, published many lectures by Heinzen and advertised their sale in a local freethought newspaper, the Iconoclast. One that would have a profound but controversial impact was his 1882 lecture, Separation of State and Church. Heinzen took the Jeffersonian maxim of separation of church and state, but to a whole different level. Instead of a mere political interest in separating the state from the church, Heinzen believed that the state should be separate from religion. Heinzen wrote, "To secure this freedom, it is the business of the state not to hinder it. Insofar, therefore, everyone must be retaining his expression for separation of religion and state, i.e., in other words, for securing religious and every other conviction and its expression against encroachments by the powers of the state." In this regard, Heinzen was actually closer to the Enlightenment tradition of freedom of conscience, a philosophy predicated on the protection of individual beliefs from encroachments by the state. What made his perspective different, however, was also a commitment to a free society in general. Religion should be free, Heinzen exclaimed, but not a license for infringing the common rights and for breaking the laws of the state. This prescient distinction between the rights of the individual and privileges bestowed by society would influence the founding documents of the Freethinkers Society of Indianapolis and their own advocacy in the political sphere. In all, Heinzen's revolutionary writings on religion, politics, and society became heavily influential to freethinkers throughout the Midwest, and some within Indianapolis's German-American community created an organization for the propagation of Heinzen's essential ideas. As such an outgrowth, German Americans Karl Beschlag, Clemens Vonnegut, and Erman Lieber, among others, founded the Freethinkers Society of Indianapolis on April 3, 1870. As the city's first public non-religious organization, the society used the Social Turnverein, a German-American social club at 230 East Maryland Street, as the venue for the majority of their initial meetings. These three men, alongside future society president Philip Rappaport, served as the intellectual bedrock of the Freethinkers Society, and the Turnverein provided the institutional infrastructure needed for the society's future growth. To understand their lives is to understand the Freethinkers Society. A professor, postal delivery clerk, and Heinzen devotee, Karl Beschlag was born in Bavaria and came to the United States as a political refugee, most likely the result of the 1848 failed revolutions. After time in St. Louis and Detroit as a newspaper editor, Beschlag spent the last 14 years of his life in Indianapolis, using his skills as a writer for local German newspaper publications. Beschlag, as a key figure within the German-American free thought community, largely inspired the society's inception. As chronicled in the society's official minutes, Mr. Beschlag gave a lecture and illustrated different points of view essential for a union of liberal German elements who, because of their disagreement, could not reach a goal until it was reached through their cooperation. Beschlag believed that the founding of the society could bring together all the disparate elements of German free thought within their community and organize them toward providing education and fellowship for future freethinkers. Further illustrating his commitment to this cause, he wrote the organization's original constitution and was elected as its first permanent lecturer. His death in 1883 cut short his influence within the society, but his impact on the society's formation was never lost on future members. Another principal founder, Erman Lieber, belonged to the larger Lieber family, one of Indianapolis's most accomplished German-American families. Born in Dusseldorf, Germany, Lieber came to the United States in 1853, seeking more freedom than the failed revolutions of 1848 provided his former home. He came to Indianapolis shortly thereafter and built his small framing store into one of the most respected art dealerships of its era, employing over 200 people. Like Beschlag, Lieber read Karl Heinzen's works and even used his own publishing house for disseminating Heinzen's lectures to the general public, as I mentioned earlier, advertising their sale in the local freethought newspaper, The Iconoclast. In an effort to instill the values of skepticism, athleticism, and education of Heinzen and other German thinkers, Lieber helped found the more politically radical Social Turnverein during the late 1860s. This organization proved essential to the formation and success of the Freethinker Society. Most importantly, he served as one of the Freethinker Society's earliest organizers. He actively participated in executive committee meetings from its foundation in 1870, and later served as society president from 1875 to 1879. Philip Rappaport, while not a principal founder, became one of the society's most influential members. Born in Fürth, Bavaria in March 1845, Rappaport came to the United States in 1868. He lived in West Virginia for 2 years, learning the craft of newspaper editing before moving to Indianapolis in 1870. After a small stint practicing law, Rappaport bought the Indiana Tribune in 1873. The Tribune became the flagship German newspaper in Indianapolis, and Rappaport served as its editor-in-chief until 1900. As the most outspoken socialist within the leadership of the Freethinkers Society, Rappaport oftentimes used the society, the Social Turnverein, and his newspaper for expressing his radical views. He became the president of the society in 1879 and served for 4 years until his resignation in 1883. Of the 4 major members of the society, Rappaport's own political views embodied the closest relationship to their intellectual fountainhead, Karl Heinzen. However, the most influential member of the society, both in its time and afterward, was Clemens Vonnegut. Born November 20th, 1824 in Munster, Westphalia, Vonnegut was educated in German public schools and apprenticed as a mercantile clerk. He came to the United States in the early 1830s on assignment from his employer, J.L. DeBall and Company, which had specialized in specialty fabrics. His year in New York convinced the young Vonnegut that America would be his permanent home, and he traveled to Indianapolis with his friend Charles Vollmer to start a new life. He founded the Vonnegut Hardware Store in 1852 and was considered one of the city's most respected citizens. Like Lieber, he was a co-founder of the Social Turnverein and a forceful voice for public education, founding the German English Independent School and serving on its board for over 30 years. He served as the first president of the Freethinkers Society from 1870 to 1875, gave lectures to the society on occasion, and even translated Robert Ingersoll's open letter to the clergy of Indianapolis into German for publication. Overall, following the actions of these 4 men tells the larger story of the Freethinkers Society. And I'll just show you guys this. I believe I have a picture of these 2. Yeah, here we go. Here's a picture on the left is Clemens, and on the right is a picture of Erman Lieber. Unfortunately, I don't have pictures of the other 2 guys. The Freethinkers Society of Indianapolis, from its inception to its dissolution in 1890, had 2 primary goals for its organization: education and advocacy. You see, there we go. And just to let you guys know, this picture is actually, I believe, like the original handwritten notes from the minutes. This is a page from the minutes. Okay. Education came in the form of lectures and talks, often given by society members, on topics relevant to freethinkers, such as socialism, women's suffrage, science, theology, and American government. Alongside these lectures, the society also devoted resources, both financial and instructional, to schools and extracurricular services for youth. The leadership of the society deeply believed that the success of their organization and the free thought movement in general hinged on educating the young in free thought and secularist ideas. As such, the association also purchased school books and established a series of secular schools, including an industrial trade school. Their secular Sunday school, held at the German English School at 216 East Maryland Street, boasted strong attendance through most of the year. Advocacy came in the form of alliances with national free thought groups and a dedication to the separation of church and state. To get a sense of these 2 goals and whether the society actually achieved them, a detailed analysis is in order. First, a discussion of membership. Historian George Probst, in his study, The Germans in Indianapolis, 1840 to 1918, claimed that the society had a membership of 150. His source for this number is William Holloway's 1870 History of Indianapolis, who also claimed that the quarterly membership fee was only $1. Holloway does not cite a source for these numbers, and the official minutes of the society do not corroborate this number. According to the society's official minutes, quarterly dues in 1870 were $8.25. The society treasurer collected in the first quarter $196.25, which is roughly 24 people. The society minutes never placed the membership rolls this high, even as fees for dues decreased. In 1878, the minutes recorded their membership at 47, and the year before was 36. In 1880, that number went back down to 35. 1882 saw its highest numbers at 80. While many non-members attended lectures and volunteered their time, the permanent dues-paying membership never reached the 150 member mark indicated by Probst and Holloway. As mentioned above, giving educational lectures became one of the most important aspects of the Freethinkers Society, especially in its peak years. These lectures served the group in two ways. It provided communal experiences that are often lost on those without religious belief. And second, it allowed its members to have vibrant conversations that were related to the promotion of free thought ideas. The first lecture by a member recorded in the minutes, which addressed an educational subject and not official society business, came from Philip Rappaport in 1875. Entitled, "What Do We Need?" Rappaport's lecture argued for economic protectionism, civil service reform, and the adoption of the gold standard as a remedy for the prevailing evil in the social and political life. Vonnegut and Lieber and other members of the society also gave lectures on religion, politics, philosophy, and science. Additionally, if outside lecturers addressed the society, it published advertisements for them in the local paper. While lectures provided the majority of its society of the society's in-house education, it also held spirited debates and evenings of entertainment. Society members often debated the intricacies of scientific discovery, whether socialism was a viable political system, or most interestingly, the validity of women's suffrage. The most fascinating part of these debates involved Philip Rappaport, who changed his mind on whether or not women should have the right to vote. In an 1876 debate during a society meeting, Rappaport gave an eloquent speech against women's suffrage, but by 1882, in another debate, he is in favor. True to the creed of free thought, Rappaport must have changed his mind when the evidence convinced him to. Also, entertainment became a mainstay for the society. Musical interludes routinely occurred at Freethinker Society meetings, especially vocal numbers by either members or their wives. Alongside education, advocacy for secularism and free thought motivated the Freethinkers Society of Indianapolis. Co-founder Herman Lieber wrote a letter to Congress in 1877 protesting, my slides say 1876, it should be 1877, protesting a proposed constitutional amendment that recognized Christianity as the official state religion. Also in that year, the society held a meeting and discussion on the creation of a possible statewide free thought organization, what they called a state liberal league. When these plans never came to fruition, the society decided to coordinate its activism with free thought organizations in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Years later, they held a 150th anniversary party for the birth of noted freethinker and American revolutionary Thomas Paine, encouraging all freethinkers in the city to attend. As a barb against superstition, the society held a special meeting in 1883 that celebrated the cultural impact of Protestant reformer Martin Luther, while simultaneously criticizing what they saw as his religious dogmatism and a lack of egalitarianism with regards to the German peasants. Lastly, the society even set aside funds for the printing and dissemination of Karl Heinzen's free thought lecture, 6 Letters to a Godly Man, as an educational tool for the group. In both their educational and advocacy roles, the Freethinker Society stayed very active throughout these 1870s and 1880s. In some respects, Philip Rappaport's resignation as society president in 1883 signaled the beginning of the end. Their shift in the late 1880s into more educational initiatives through the Sunday School, the German English School, and the Industrial Trade School moved their energies away from community outreach, advocacy, and membership growth. As such, the society spread itself too thin, and a lack of enthusiasm unfortunately set in. After meager attempts at reform and reorganization, the Freethinkers Society of Indianapolis formally dissolved in April of 1890. The organization divided its assets among multiple educational initiatives and charitable organizations within the German-American community. Despite its success in the 1870s and 1880s, the Freethinkers Society never escaped the stigma of being, quote unquote, a conflict movement, or a movement typically supported by minorities or slim majorities of populations and confront fundamental organized opposition in attempting to bring about social change. After the end of the society, Clemens Vonnegut continued his free thought activism more than any other former member, mostly through writing. And on the right here, you'll see the front page of the reprint edition of his pamphlet, A Proposed Guide for Instruction in Morals, which was published originally in 1900. It clearly enunciated his philosophy of free thought, both in theory and in practice. Also, it has like the longest title. It's in my talk here, I have it like the short version, but the full title of the lecture is like A Proposed Guide for Instruction in Morals from the Standpoint of a Free Thinker for Adult Persons, offered by a dilettante. It's like the longest title ever, and I love it because it's so indicative of its era. So where was I here? The treatise displayed a rhetorical flourish that a future member of the Vonnegut family would cite as an influence. Echoing Ingersoll and Heinzen before him, Vonnegut declared that no religious creed has any real proofs. It rests simply on assertions. However, that does not mean that humanity cannot be moral. In fact, Vonnegut argued the opposite. This is a quote from him. True virtue is its own reward, which is not enhanced, but rather misled by belief. Belief deprives us of the joys of this world by teaching us that we must detest them, and instead of them, we must hope for a heaven. Belief forms the germ for persecution of those who differ from us in their religious convictions. Vonnegut saw morality as the wellspring of the intrinsic quality of human character, which ought to be nourished and cultivated early, continually, and carefully. In subsequent pages, Vonnegut explained how such cultivation is achieved. Public education, family instruction, physical fitness, and social activities presented the means by which individuals perfected a moral life without the supernatural. Like Ingersoll, Vonnegut's morality was clear, traditional, based in the family, and demonstrated a moral life without the need of a god. While Clemens Vonnegut presented his philosophy clearly, the events surrounding his death were anything but. Clemens Vonnegut died in the snow, or so the story goes. Literature icon Kurt Vonnegut, Clemens's great-grandson, recalls this story in his autobiographical work, Palm Sunday. In the winter of 1906, Clemens Vonnegut supposedly went for a routine stroll. Having lost his way, he wandered the streets of Indianapolis for hours before he was found dead by the side of the road by a search party. The story bewildered Kurt, whose own free thought can be traced to his great-grandfather and his own extended family. However, as with many family stories, this one stretches the truth a little. Clemens did not die by the side of the road, but was rather found unconscious. The Indianapolis News reported that C.W. Jones, a local construction worker, found the 82-year-old Vonnegut nearly 5 miles from the city in Crawfordsville Pike. He sustained injuries to his head and right shoulders, but doctors feared that exposure to the elements might be his biggest challenge. After fighting for his life for 5 days, Clemens Vonnegut succumbed to pneumonia on January 13, 1906. His obituary cited his charity, love for knowledge, and his activities within the social triumvirate, the Freethinkers Society, and his 27-year service for a local school board. True to his iconoclastic nature, Vonnegut wrote his own eulogy back in the 1870s and asked for its recitation when he died. In it, he railed against the creeds of Christianity. And this is the extended quote that's also on the slide. I do not believe in the atonement to the blood of Christ or in the sin of incredulity. I do not believe in a punishment in a future life. I believe neither in a personal God nor a personal devil, but I honor the ideal which man has created as the tenor of all virtues and perfections and has named God. Until the very end, Vonnegut believed in the power of humanity to throw off the shackles of religion and embrace the values of inquiry and human-based ethics. Nearly a century later, Kurt Vonnegut Jr., born November 11th, 1922, here in Indianapolis, wrote that his great-grandfather's free thought was his own ancestral religion, and that he was pig-headedly proud of the heretical nature of his family. Kurt Vonnegut, a future honorary president of the American Humanist Association, carried the torch of free thought for his great-grandfather, and in some respects introduced his ideas to a whole new generation. In many of his works, Kurt Vonnegut would openly criticize religion, spirituality, and faith, so much so that it even ruined one of his marriages. Nevertheless, echoing his grandfather in a 1980 speech at the First Parish Unitarian Church, Vonnegut declared, "Doesn't God give dignity to everybody? No, not in my opinion. Giving dignity, the sort of dignity that is of earthly use anyway, is something that only people do, or fail to do." Kurt's connections to free thought go deeper than his great-grandfather. His father, renowned architect Kurt Vonnegut Sr., married Edith Lieber of the illustrious Lieber family. Herman Lieber, successful art dealer and co-founder of the Freethinkers Society of Indianapolis, was Edith's great-great-uncle. Growing up, young Kurt received his religious instruction not from his parents, but from his nanny and housekeeper, Ida Young. She would often read him Bible passages, exposing him to her interpretation of Christianity. In contrast, his parents only took the children to Unitarian-based services twice a year. Biographer Charles J. Shields quotes Vonnegut as saying these church attendances were merely a theatrical event. The often contradictory nature of his upbringing influenced Kurt's complicated position towards religion and spirituality. In many of his letters, his complex interrelationships between the sacred and profane often appeared. While Vonnegut would often reassert his free thought, trained in agnosticism and the social sciences, I find superficial and obvious explanations for whatever, whenever possible, he nonetheless appeared to ecclesiastical ephemera, at least in metaphor. In a November 28, 1967 letter to the Massachusetts Draft Board, number 1, at the height of the Vietnam War, Vonnegut wrote this about the relationship between the God concept and war. And here's an extended quote from him. "This attitude toward killing, war through drafting soldiers, is a matter between my God and me. I do not participate much in organized religion. I've read the Bible a lot. I preach after a fashion. I write books which express my disgust for people who find it easy and reasonable to kill. We say grace at meals, taking turns. Every member of my large family has been called upon to thank God for blessings which have been ours. What Mark is doing now, his son, seeking conscientious objector status, is in the service of God, whose son was exceedingly unwarlike." Note the phrase, "my God," the distinction between the God of common American experience and Vonnegut's conception stresses his humanism. Much like his great-grandfather's use of God as an ideal in his 1906 eulogy, Kurt Vonnegut used the language of Christianity metaphorically as an explication of his personal disgust of violence. His most popular novel, Slaughterhouse-Five, 1969, also reinforces Kurt's strong abhorrence of war and a belief in a common humanity. Specifically, "so it goes" is a phrase that Vonnegut peppered throughout the novel, often after horrible events or even banal ones. This phrase shows no matter how bad things get, no matter how high one can get, the world and indeed the universe goes on. As an example, this passage from the novel describing the protagonist Billy Pilgrim's memory of a sculpture of Jesus is fairly apt. A military surgeon would have admired the clinical fidelity of the artist's rendition of all Christ's wounds, the spear wound, the thorn wounds, the holes that were made by the iron spikes. Billy's Christ died horribly. He was pitiful. So it goes. So it goes becomes the novel's panacea, a way for the narrator to deal with the grim realities of war without the comfort of religious beliefs. In some respects, it can be seen as a mantra for humanism. Recalling again his metaphorical religiosity, Vonnegut did have a radically humanistic view of Jesus Christ, even though he did not identify as a Christian. He emphasized his non-Christianity in a 1979 letter to Nancy Vonnegut about his future wedding to Jill Kremens. "It," meaning the wedding, "will be as secular as I can make it, since I am not a Christian of any kind." Writing in one of his last books, A Man Without a Country, Vonnegut outlined his view of Jesus as a character of moral and historical importance. How do humanists feel about Jesus, wrote Vonnegut. I say of Jesus as all humanists do, if what he said is good, and so much of it is absolutely beautiful, what does it matter if he was God or not? Later in the book, Vonnegut calls Jesus the greatest and most humane of human beings, and waxes mournfully about modern Christians' inability to emphasize the Sermon on the Mount, specifically the Beatitudes. For some reason, Vonnegut continues, the most vocal Christians among us never mention the Beatitudes. Blessed are the merciful in a courtroom. Blessed are the peacemakers in the Pentagon. Give me a break. To Vonnegut, Christ should be seen as a moral idea and not a prophet or a savior, much the way his great-grandfather saw the meek and mild carpenter from Nazareth. Thus, Jesus becomes an icon of humanism rather than a figure of religious devotion. True to his roots, Kurt Vonnegut carried his humanism through to the end of his life. In an address he meant to give on April 27, 2007, he died on April 11th, his son Mark gave the address in his stead. In this address, written for Indianapolis's Year of Vonnegut celebrations, Kurt espoused his continued commitment to humanism. And I quote, "Am I religious? I practice a disorganized religion. I belong to an unholy disorder. We call ourselves Our Lady of Perpetual Consternation. We are as celibate as 50% of the heterosexual Roman Catholic clergy. Actually, when I hold up my right hand like this, it means I'm not kidding, that I give my word of honor that what I'm about to say is true. So actually, I'm an honorary president of the American Humanist Society, having succeeded the late great science fiction writer Isaac Asimov in that utterly functionalist capacity. We humanists believe as well as we can, we humanists behave as well as we can, without any expectation of rewards or punishments in an afterlife. We serve as best we can the only abstraction with which we have any real familiarity, which is our community." This emphasis on community squares nicely with Clemens's own commitment to community, both with the Freethinkers Society and with his advocacy of public education. They both understood that the values of sociality and camaraderie are essential to the flourishing of a community, and you can achieve that system without a supernatural element. Clemens Vonnegut's humanism carried through many generations of his family and left an indelible mark on Kurt Vonnegut. The two men's rejection of religion and supernatural beliefs reinforced their love for humanity, their desire for community, and their commitment to the truth, no matter how horrifying it may be. Kurt's own success as a writer and social critic would have delighted Clemens, who participated in many of the same literary pursuits and public debates decades before Kurt was born. As such, their two lives, separated by time, nevertheless become entwined by their ideals. Their humanist legacy reinforces the diversity of intellectual and moral philosophies that embody the American Midwest throughout the 19th, 20th, and early 21st centuries. Both Vonneguts were proud to be from Indianapolis, and we should be too. Thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions?
Justin, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, this is Bill Selm talking. Now, I appreciate your research, and the records of the Freithinker Verein are there at IUPUI, correct?
Yes. Yeah, they are the original actual bound records in the original German are there, as well as the English translation that was done in the 1980s.
Oh, so everything of the Freithinker Verein has been translated.
Yes.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's wonderful. Now, I wanted to comment. You said that the Freithinker Verein dissolved in 1890.
Yes.
But it was successful.
Yes.
Because what they did, because of Clemens Vonnegut and almost 30 years on the school board of IPS, he and some of the other Germans reformed IPS and turned it into truly a wonderful educational system. The reason that the Germans founded the German English school was that they couldn't believe the low standards that the, well, I guess you call it, that the English had here in Indianapolis, and what they define as public school. They were horrified by it.
Mhm.
But at the same time, they wanted to continue German language and instruction, but they did not want to send them to the Catholic or the Lutheran schools, which were teaching in German. And the Catholic one would have been St. Mary's. And so they achieved their goals by reforming the school system here, and therefore they didn't mission accomplished.
I agree with you. Yeah.
And then their other institution was the Industrial Arts School, or the Gewerbeschule. Well, again, IPS, of course, with Charles Emmerich, IPS then adopts the industrial arts. And that, of course, we know that because there's Emmerich Manual High School, named after Charles Emmerich, who was also, in this cabal of German liberals, but then also Arsenal Technical High School. Mission accomplished. Mission accomplished. And then, of course, their other interest was in German language, which, of course, then IPS has had a broad and deep German curriculum. And then Vonnegut, in his role on the school board, is constantly inviting the other board members to go to the Turner Hall. Now, that's before the Athenaeum, the previous one over there on Maryland. Constantly inviting them all the time to witness a program of gymnastics. And then eventually, gymnastics or physical education is part of the official curriculum of IPS. Mission accomplished. Mission accomplished. So these four principles, they were successful with. Now, what do we have today? I'm not going to comment on that. But Vonnegut and others at Emmerich, worked so diligently to make the public school system something of value, because when they got here, they saw it having no value whatsoever. So, mission accomplished. Thank you so very much for your presentation. I appreciate your depth and going into the archives at IUPUI, which is a wealth of information for looking for the Turnvereins, for the Normal College, the American Turners, and other groups such as the Freithinkerverein. Oh, by the way, there is a framed photograph in the Athenaeum on the wall of the Freisinnige Sonntagsschule. So there are the children at the Athenaeum on a Sunday morning, and I always call that the anti-Sunday school Sunday school. And it was linked, of course, just intimately linked with the Turnverein, and especially the one which the Sozialer Turnverein, which built the Athenaeum. All right. Thank you so much, and I'll leave it open for other questions.
I also would like to comment briefly. Thank you so much for your remarks, Bill. Those are really great. And I think like another avenue of research for people is to go more into what you just described, which is that educational influence. Because I kind of took a different track, and I was like, I want to write about Kurt Vonnegut. This is my roundabout way of writing about Kurt Vonnegut. But the educational stuff is so important. And I think that would be a really great place to do additional research. So thank you so much for noting that.
Oh, you're welcome. Fine job.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Justin, we talked to Justin before we started, and he did indicate that I know everybody's muted because that's how we start these, but if you want to raise your hand, like you can do your little reaction hand or your real hand. There's Giles. Let's get him out there. Hold on. Go ahead. You'll have to unmute.
I really enjoy this, and thank you for taking up the Freithinker cudgel and carrying on the study of it. There's an excellent article by Sabina Jessner from IUPUI's history department that probably one of the best overviews up to that point. Here is a copy of the original Zittenlehre by Kurt Vonnegut, and he calls himself a dilettante. It was published without his name, but it was published in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, at the Freithinker Publishing Company up there. So actually, his tract did get all around in the realm of the Freithinker, and of course, he 10 years later had an English translation, which is very good. And that got around in the Unitarian humanist schools. Interestingly enough, his brother Bernhard stayed in Germany, in Münster, and when the Zittenlehre came out, Clemens sent him a copy thereof. Well, we have the letters that the brother wrote back. We translated them now too. That point by point, based on the Bible, how wrong Clemens was. So clearly his family back in Germany, particularly the brother who remained a dedicated Catholic, and the Bernhard name follows through in the family, because Kurt's brother, of course, is named Bernhard too, the professor from Brown, I think it was. But in any event, NCSA Literature intends to publish an omnibus volume containing a lot of this stuff, including all of the funeral orations that were given, including by Karl Emmers, who did a very eloquent presentation on him, on Clemens, and also Theodor Stempfel, who wrote the Festschrift for the opening of the German house and so on. It was also a later freethinker. So there's a lot of this, and hopefully we can get this all together and put an omnibus volume out with some notes about this, because it's as you've described it. I mean, it's fascinating and probably more far-reaching even beyond Kurt's works, but definitely through Kurt's works than we realize. So thank you again for doing that, and this is inspiring for us to publish some of these things. Clemens' self-composed funeral oration is just great. Just one more thing, that with the feminine side of it, in the minutes, you may have noticed that the best minutes, the most accurate, the ones with the clearest German Outschrift handwriting, was by Fanny Oppenheimer, a female, who wrote. She had the most complete minutes and perfectly done. I mean, just that's how we know really more about what was written or what was said in the meetings than by any of the other people, Beischlag or Clemens himself. So again, thank you, and really enjoyed that.
Well, thank you so much for your kind words, Giles. And you were very inspirational to me early on when I was working on this, because when I took Karen Roche's class on German Americans when I was finishing up graduate school, you came and gave a talk, and it was really, really insightful. You were talking about, like, in these German Americans, you had the non-religious Germans and you had the religious Germans, and you kind of broke it down. And that was so helpful for me in working on my own research. So I really appreciated that. And I'm with you on those additional materials. I mean, I think they would be an amazing resource to publish, and hopefully at some point also provide digitally too. Because so much of the German American community materials, whether with the Turnvereins or other organizations, are all online through Indiana Memory, which I help manage, and through IPY's collections. And then, yeah, so, and then you're absolutely right about Fanny Oppenheimer. Like her stuff's the best. Like because if you read the beginning minutes that were written by the guys, they're very just like procedural. It's very boring. And then once you get to her, it's like really where you get like the best information. Like that's how I learned about the stuff about Rappaport in relation to women's suffrage, was through her notes. So it's like she was incredible. So I mean, what an amazing person to have taken such dedicated notes.
Well, one would like to have met Fanny. And the other is of course Philip Rappaport.
Yep.
Was extremely literate, and his son Leo Rappaport, who carried on the traditions in the Turners and also became a rather successful lawyer in Indianapolis, utterly bilingual. The people were so articulate in both languages, just stunning. He went to that German English school, and we know a lot about them and the school through that book, which has not been totally translated, on Our Old School, that was put together by in any event, was it Stenzel himself? I've forgotten. But in any event, that
Theodor Stein.
Thank you, Theodor Stein,
Yep.
put together that, and it's a marvelous compendium of writings from these successful German Americans that came out of that German English school. That's another book, Steve. I don't know if he's there, but we have to republish that. And some of the essays are in English, but the majority of it is in German. And it's not.
I know that book was digitized and made available on the Internet Archive. I forget who did it, but I know it's there because I looked at it when I was doing my research initially. But yeah, I think a new edition of that would be incredible, because as I think you and Bill and everybody's noted tonight, like all of this stuff is so interconnected. And it really is this community. And that's so, I think, interesting when you think about the history and the legacy of these individuals and their communities.
Yeah.
And I want to add that Theodor Stein book also has a wonderful collection of portraits of the members and also the date that they arrived in Indianapolis and from where. So that's a fantastic resource.
Plus architecture, plus pictures of buildings and so on. And then old sketches of Indianapolis, wie es damals war, Indianapolis as it was then, around the 1850s and so on. These beautiful sketches. I mean, that book is, we gotta get that out.
So Giles, that's the book that you are going to finish translating and then published through NCS Literature?
Sorry, what?
That's the book that you're going to finish translating and then publish through NCS Literature, correct?
No, that was
Okay.
actually the Sir Irvis, the letters out of Columbus.
Okay, so that's already available.
Yeah, the book is as digitized and online, but it's not translated. Just the letters that, or the items that are in German. So the Theodor Stein book.
Okay.
But that's one we really have to get out.
Do you know, are there other artifacts from these organizations? So sometimes when you're going through the old rooms in whether the Athenaeum or old libraries, you'll see like big poster boards, or the Historical Society has them with members on them and other artifacts. Are there existing artifacts from this organization and these organizations that are stored away somewhere that you know of?
Not that I know of beyond the materials we've already discussed. So like the letters were preserved. We have photographs of some of the members. And then there are some institutions in town that still have photographs up of these people. So the one institution that I was involved in that used to have pictures up on the wall of these four guys was CFI, Indianapolis, the Center for Inquiry, which is the free thought, the current free thought organization, but they're not like artifacts. It's just like reprints or whatever.
Okay, I mean, there's pictures of them all over the city, but in the context of Freethinker, but that sounds like a good resource.
That would be a cool resource, and that would be something to look into more and see if what we have. But I have not seen anything of that. Most of what we've got is mostly like the paper records, and that has been, I think, extensively archived and to a certain extent translated by IPOI. But but maybe somebody would have something. Who knows? I mean, you never know what might pop up in a city when you're doing like a remodeling or something like that, or who knows, eBay. You'd be surprised what things end up on eBay. But I'm not aware of anything. But there might be folks on this conversation tonight that might.
We do get copies of things given to us by families at the Max Kade German American Center at IUPUI. This was given to me by Richard Vonnegut, the nephew or the uncle or the cousin of Kurt, who passed away recently, and was a very philanthropic fellow when it came to the Athenaeum, which the Athenaeum, of course, was designed by Kurt's grandfather, and Kurt's called it his, told another writer, famous writer, that was his grandfather's masterpiece. It was interesting.
I met Richard Vonnegut. He was a really, really nice man. He was there in the studio with us when we did the Hoosier History Live radio episode.
Well, and that's his son.
Yeah, or Richard. Not Richard. Who was the gentleman you mentioned? I'm sorry.
That's his father.
Father, yeah. Sorry.
Yeah.
I met the younger man rather, and we had lunch. And it was really nice. But yeah, that's
Richie Jr.
Yes, that's who I met. Lovely guy, and
he's a really funny fellow.
He's a nice dude, and I remember him. He arrived by bicycle.
Yes.
And he was very passionate about talking about all of this with us. We talked about it over Mexican food after the episode wrapped, and it was a really, really nice time chatting with him. And I'm really happy with that episode. I think Nelson and I really did not to toot my own horn too much, but I think we did a pretty good episode. And I remember Molly Head, who's the producer of that show, was like, she was like really happy with this. I remember her email was hilarious. It was like, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Show.
Yeah.
No, it was a great show.
Thank you. Are these headstones from the members? I'm
This is
curious.
Jasper.
Okay.
You were on the program. You said, was there any free thinkers out in the smaller communities? And this is the one free thinker that I know lived in Jasper. He was buried. He couldn't be buried in the Catholic cemetery, so they put him in the city cemetery for Protestants. So you can see down at the bottom where it says free thinker.
Can you click on that? Was that ping pong?
What's that?
One of the active freethinkers was one of the teachers was I forgot his first name, but Pink Ponk was his last name. And he died there in southern Indiana rather ignominiously and is buried down there. So that may be Pink Ponk.
Ping Pong also had a bookstore and the signage that was bilingual. I think it was Carl Ping Pong.
I think you're right, Bill. Carl Ping Pong.
And it was very close to the Turnverein, but also St. Mary's Catholic Church.
Interesting. But that whole area in Indianapolis around the old Germantown, it's really a great model of talking about diversity and inclusion. It's got the Zion Evangelical ENR, Evangelical Reformed Church, and then there was the German Methodist Church, and then there was the Pure Evangelical Church, which is torn down. And then, of course, the St. Marienkirche, St. Mary's, and it's all in there. And then the Vonnegut lived in Germantown over in what's now called Lockerbie, as well as some of the other chaps that we've been talking about.
And also the Jewish temple was in the Germantown area.
Yes. Well, the Rappaports were actually secular Jewish people, as a matter of fact. And it shows how inclusive the Freidenker and the fact that Fanny Oppenheimer was so active in the Freidenker Verein shows how inclusive they were, but also the Rappaports. And there were more of the Jewish communities, very secular Jewish community that were involved with the Turnverein and with the Freidenker. This is really very interesting.
Well, I'm going to ask Janet, do we have other people who want to make comments or questions, Janet?
You're muted. You're muted.
Can't hear you, Janet.
I'm sorry. We probably ought to reach out and ask others, because that's where we were working from a question there. And any of our other guests interested in posing a question or making comments? I don't see any hands going up. I know you're muted, and at this point would be happy to hear from you if you'd like, but if not, perhaps that.
I saw Edward Schoenfeld was waiting to come into the discussion. I saw that on the screen.
Well, I thought Norbert Kropp was here earlier, and I believe he was taking notes, but he is not with us now. So,
Well, I don't want to dominate all this discussion, but I do have something else to add. Dr. DeVita, James DeVita, when he was writing the history of St. Mary's Parish, he saw that Clemens Vonnegutt's two older sons were baptized in the Catholic Church. So obviously Clemens was either hedging his bets or he was still in a state of discernment and not completely rejecting his traditional family religion. Of course, Munster is a Catholic city, and that area of Munsterland was a very Catholic area, so it was very, very ingrained. But it took him a while, I think, to evolve into the Freidenker. That's based on that, having his sons baptized, and that was Clemens and Bernard, are the two older ones who have Christian names. The others were George and Franklin after George Washington. So the idea is two Christian saints and then two American secular saints, George Washington and Benjamin Franklin.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I think that kind of goes into what I was talking about earlier about like Kurt Vonnegut Jr., about how he had this very interesting sort of humanism that was very influenced by Christianity. Like there was this sort of attempt to sort of reconcile a lot of the good of Christianity that Vonnegut saw with his own free thought beliefs. And I think that is that sort of interesting, sort of complicated interaction between those two things. I think that makes total sense considering, the history of his great grandfather and his lineage.
Well, Janet, do we have any other commenters?
I haven't seen a hand go up.
Okay.
Oh, wait, Giles.
Giles.
Sorry, but yeah, there were more. There was the female side to the Vonnegut family, not to forget, and I know for the Protestant, the German orphans' home, so-called Protestant German orphans' home, which was on Pleasant Run, that the Vonnegut family, particularly Mrs. Vonnegut, gave generously to the founding of that so-called Protestant orphans home. And I think that she was, we don't know that much about her, except she was active in the Damenverein, as some of the other Vonnegut women were, the ladies' society of the Turners. But we don't really know too much about them beyond what's in the minutes of the Damenverein. So, but Mrs. Funnegood was not a shrinking violet, and was very interested in the philanthropic aspects of the city. So that may have had something to do with their being the children being baptized.
So I'm going to make an assumption that maybe she was Catholic also. I think her name was Katarina Blanc. So maybe she was Catholic as well. Don't know.
I think Jim has a question. Jim, can you unmute yourself? I just invited you to. Jim, you need to unmute yourself. I'm trying to. Oh,
How's that? Can you hear
Okay.
me?
yes.
Yeah. Here's the book called Serving the Immigrant that Dr. DeVita did for the Centennial St. Mary's Church. And there's a section in here on Vonnegut's membership of that parish when it was on Maryland Street. There's a couple pages of discussion in it, but it was, an interesting connections were made, and some got into a little bit about the disputes he had with the pastor, Father Scheidler. And it's another resource that's there. I don't know if you've seen it or familiar with the book.
I'm
It's-
not.
it
That,
looks like
but
it's
that
got
would
a
be
wonderful, has a wonderful sketch on the front of it by Frederick.
Sure
Hahn,
does.
Yes, who was one of one of the founders up at Heron. His name slips my mind right now, but great book on not just the parish, but the history of the German community.
Yeah, I'll have to check that resource out. I did not come across that in my research. The
Oh,
one thing I'm
really?
thinking, so with this discussion is, how they're sort of there are people who are secular Jews, right? To a certain extent, maybe Clemens was a secular Catholic, if that's such a thing. I don't know. I'm not Catholic, but that would be interesting that he sort of was committed to the community of it, but was.
Oh, he was a member of the parish. It's
Yeah.
recorded in here.
That's so cool. That's really cool. So I think it goes back to what we were chatting earlier about that interesting sort of dynamic between, some, religious ideas, some non-religious ideas, and kind of trying to figure out how to reconcile those two, if you can. And that's super interesting to me for sure.
Here's a whole piece on Vonnegut and the parish.
Oh, okay. Great. That's so cool. Thank you for sharing that with me.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that with us. That's amazing.
Yeah.
We definitely know that the Vonnegut celebrated Christmas, and the Catholicism, the Christian religion, is such an integral part of the German heritage, the Western heritage in general, but in Germany in particular, maybe that it's hard to get yourself away from it. So they did have Christmas trees. They did celebrate the Christmas. There's pictures of the Vonnegut household, as a matter of fact, with the Christmas trees. And of course, they always had them in the Deutsches Haus in the Athenaeum, and then in the Soziale Turnverein.
Yeah.
So it was a very important cultural event, Weihnachten.
Yes, but they called instead of Easter, they called the Frühlingsfest. Did you remember that poster that's framed?
Yes.
At the Athenaeum?
Well, Easter's going just too far. Christmas is one thing, but Easter is another. That is very, very bound into the Christian doctrine. Christmas less so.
All right. Any other questions for Justin? Well, I would
Great.
say this has been. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just saying, it's a great paper. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you all very much.
This has been a very successful Stammtisch program, and Justin, you need to keep coming to our programs and learn other diverse aspects of the Indiana Germans. So I'm going to tell everybody, thank you and good night, especially thank you to Justin. This was outstanding. All right. Good night.
Auf Wiedersehen.
It is
Thank you all very much. Have a good evening.